It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind that made Evelyn Carter feel like time had slowed down just for her. At 65, she had settled into the rhythms of her life in a way that made everything predictable, comfortable, even. Her husband, Richard, had left early for one of his business trips, as he often did. The kids were grown, scattered across different cities, busy with their own lives. That left Evelyn with the house, the garden, and her long walks around the neighborhood. But this morning was different. Jason Parker, the 23-year-old son of the Neighbours, had been hanging around more often lately. A little too often, Evelyn thought, but she never said anything. What would she say? That it thrilled her when he looked at her in a way she hadn't been looked at in years? That his casual compliments about her garden, or the way she still had that spark, made her feel like she was in her 20s again? Of course not. Evelyn had spent her whole life doing what was expected of her, being the proper wife, the responsible mother, and she wasn't about to let a flirtation change that. But something had changed. Jason wasn't just the boy next door anymore. He had become the man who made her heart race. The affair began as an impulse. A conversation by the fence turned into a drink on the patio. A drink on the patio became an innocent touch on the arm. Before she knew it, Evelyn was in the middle of something she couldn't quite explain. A secret she kept even from herself. She told herself it was nothing, just a little fun. Something to fill the quiet hours while Richard was away. But secrets have a way of creeping into the light, no matter how deeply you bury them. On that Saturday morning, Jason showed up unexpectedly, and Evelyn knew right away that something was different. He wasn't his usual playful self. There was something darker in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place. He stepped inside, uninvited, and Evelyn felt the air in the room change. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice lower than usual, almost a whisper. "We don't have to hide this anymore." Evelyn's heart raced, not with excitement this time, but with fear. This wasn't what she had wanted. The affair had been a game, a way to feel alive again, but it wasn't supposed to get this serious. She tried to brush it off, laugh it away, but Jason wasn't laughing. He stepped closer, too close. "What if I told Richard?" he said, his voice tightening. "What if I told the whole neighborhood?" Evelyn's stomach twisted. The blood drained from her face. This was supposed to be over. She had planned on ending it, cutting ties before it went too far. But now it seemed she had lost control of the situation, and Jason wasn't ready to let her go. "No, Jason, you can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It would ruin everything." For a moment, there was silence between them. Jason stared at her, and Evelyn saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. And that's when everything went wrong. By the time the police arrived, the once peaceful neighborhood had already started buzzing with whispers. Yellow tape cordoned off the Carter household, and curious neighbors peered from behind their curtains, trying to make sense of the flashing lights and grim faces of law enforcement officers. Evelyn sat in her living room, her hands trembling, as she tried to wrap her mind around what had just happened. The room felt small, closing in on her, the weight of the morning's events pressing down on her chest. Across the room, Detective Caroline Mercer, a no-nonsense woman in her early 40s, was jotting down notes in a small leather notebook. Her gaze flickered between Evelyn and the hallway that led to the guest bedroom, where Jason's lifeless body had been found just hours earlier. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened, Mrs. Carter," Detective Mercer said, her voice firm but not unkind. Evelyn struggled to find the words. How could she explain? How could she make anyone understand the chain of events that led to Jason's death? She took a deep breath, the sharp scent of coffee filling her nostrils. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "He was upset," she said, wringing her hands. "Things got out of control." Mercer raised an eyebrow, clearly not satisfied with the vague explanation. "Upset about what, exactly?" Evelyn paused. She had known this question was coming, but she hadn't prepared herself for it. Telling the truth felt like pulling at a loose thread that would unravel everything she had worked so hard to keep together. Her marriage, her reputation, her life. But there was no avoiding it now. I was having an affair with him," Evelyn said, the words almost choking her as they came out. She couldn't bring herself to look at the detective. "It wasn't supposed to get this far. I never wanted this." Mercer's expression remained neutral, but Evelyn saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes. Affairs were common in cases like this. They often led to jealousy, violence, and desperation. And this morning? The detective asked, leaning forward. What happened this morning? Evelyn closed her eyes, the memory still too fresh, too vivid. Jason's voice echoed in her ears, his threats, his anger. She could still feel the moment when everything shifted from passion to fear. He said he was going to tell my husband, tell the neighbors. He wanted more from me, something I couldn't give. I told him it was over, but he wouldn't leave. Mercer jotted down more notes. And then? I don't know, Evelyn stammered. He grabbed my arm. I tried to push him away. I didn't mean for it to happen, but he fell. He hit his head on the corner of the table. Mercer glanced at the photos her partner had taken of the scene. Jason had been found sprawled on the floor, a pool of blood beneath his head where he had struck the hardwood. It looked bad, very bad. Mrs. Carter, the paramedic, said there was significant trauma to the head. This wasn't just a fall, Mercer said, her tone sharpening. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. What are you saying? I'm saying, Mercer continued, there's a difference between an accident and something more intentional. We need to know what really happened in that room. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She had seen the way Jason had looked at her that morning, the possessiveness in his eyes, the anger when she tried to end things. But had she pushed him too hard? Had it been an accident? Or had her own fear and desperation driven her to do something she hadn't realized? As Mercer stood to leave, she paused at the door, giving Evelyn one last look. We'll need to speak to your husband when he gets home. Evelyn's stomach turned at the thought. Richard had no idea. He didn't know about Jason. He didn't know about the affair, the secrets, the lies. When he walked through the door later that evening, he would step into a life that was about to come crashing down around him. As the door closed behind the detective, Evelyn felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. The life she had built was unraveling, and she wasn't sure how long she could keep up the pretense of innocence. The sun was setting by the time Richard Carter pulled into the driveway, unaware that his world was about to implode. He had been out of town for days, at a conference, the kind he regularly attended for work. His travel schedule had become so routine that Evelyn barely noticed his absences anymore. But as soon as he stepped inside, something felt wrong. Evelyn was sitting in the living room, staring blankly ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up at him as he entered, her eyes glassy with fear. Before he could say a word, two detectives emerged from the kitchen, their faces grim. "Mr. Carter," Detective Mercer greeted him, stepping forward with her badge in hand. "I'm Detective Mercer with the Atlanta Police Department. We need to talk." Richard's confusion deepened. "Talk? What's going on? Evelyn, what's happening?" His wife didn't respond, couldn't respond. The weight of what had transpired was too much for her to explain in that moment. Mercer gestured for Richard to sit down, and after a long pause, he did. His eyes locked on Evelyn the whole time. "Earlier today," Mercer began, "your neighbor, Jason Parker, was found dead in your home." Richard blinked, as if he hadn't quite processed the words. "Dead? Jason?" His eyes darted to Evelyn, searching for answers. What was Jason doing here? Mercer glanced at Evelyn, whose expression remained frozen, before continuing. "Your wife has told us that there was an incident this morning. Jason came over, and things escalated. He fell and hit his head. We're still trying to determine the exact circumstances, but it's clear that there was a struggle." "A struggle?" Richard repeated, his voice rising. "Evelyn, what is she talking about?" For the first time that day, Evelyn spoke, her voice cracking under the pressure. "I'm so sorry, Richard. She couldn't finish. The words caught in her throat, and the room seemed to tilt as Richard stood up, his face reddening. "Sorry? What are you sorry for?" His voice trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "What was Jason doing here, Evelyn? What aren't you telling me?" Mercer watched the exchange closely, noting the way Richard's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with restrained emotion. This was always the hardest part, the moment when someone's life unraveled in real time. Evelyn looked up at her husband, her eyes pleading for understanding. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Richard. It was just a mistake. A terrible mistake. Richard's face fell, the color draining from his skin. What do you mean, a mistake? What did you do? Evelyn swallowed hard. I was seeing Jason. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stood there, motionless, his mouth slightly open, trying to comprehend what his wife had just said. You were what? His voice was barely above a whisper now, the disbelief thick in every syllable. You're telling me you were having an affair with that kid? Evelyn's tears flowed freely now. I didn't mean for it to happen. It just got out of control. Richard staggered backward, as if the room had suddenly shifted under his feet. His entire life felt like it had collapsed in an instant. The woman he had built a life with, the woman he thought he knew better than anyone, had been hiding something so enormous that it tore at the fabric of their marriage. You, he pointed at her, unable to find the right words. How could you? Mercer stood nearby, observing the meltdown with professional detachment. She had seen reactions like this before, though they never got easier to witness. Affairs always had a way of turning lives upside down, but this one had led to something far worse. We'll need to take your wife down to the station for further questioning, Mercer said after a long, tense silence. There are still things we need to clarify about what happened in that room. Richard didn't respond. He stood there, staring at Evelyn as if seeing her for the first time. The woman sitting before him was no longer the person he had known for 40 years. This was someone else, a stranger who had shattered their life with a secret she couldn't take back. Mercer and her partner moved toward Evelyn, gently guiding her to her feet. As they led her out of the house, Evelyn's sobs filled the quiet of the room, each one more painful than the last. Richard watched her go, his mind racing. How could this be real? How had everything fallen apart so quickly? He stood alone in the wreckage of their life, not knowing what came next. And as the front door closed, he was left with the sinking realization that the truth wasn't finished unraveling. Not by a long shot. Evelyn sat in the interrogation room, her hands trembling in her lap. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, casting a cold, sterile glow on the empty space around her. She had been in that room for what felt like hours, the silence thick with tension as Detective Mercer prepared to ask the questions that would decide her fate. Across from her, Mercer studied Evelyn's face carefully, as if waiting for the right moment to pounce. The detective had seen cases like this before. People who thought they could hide their secrets, only to watch them unravel in front of them. But there was something about Evelyn, something Mercer couldn't quite put her finger on. This case had layers, and she was determined to peel them back. You've already told us that Jason fell, Mercer said, her tone calm but sharp. But the evidence we found suggests something more than just an accident. Evelyn looked down at her hands, her heart pounding. She hadn't meant for any of this to happen. How could she explain that what started as a forbidden romance had spiraled into a nightmare she couldn't escape from? You're lying to me, Evelyn, Mercer continued. And the more you lie, the worse this is going to get for you. Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes. She was exhausted, mentally, emotionally, and physically. It was time to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I didn't mean to hurt him, Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking. I just wanted him to leave, but he wouldn't. He grabbed me, and I panicked. Mercer leaned forward. So, you pushed him? Evelyn nodded slowly. Yes, I pushed him, but I didn't mean to push him that hard. He hit his head. It all happened so fast. The detective remained silent for a moment, letting Evelyn's words sink in. She had heard similar stories before, but there was something different here. The photos from the scene had shown more than just a simple fall. The blood patterns, the position of Jason's body, it all told a different story. And the medical examiner had already confirmed that the blow to Jason's head wasn't consistent with a fall alone. You need to stop protecting yourself, Evelyn, Mercer said, her voice low but firm. The evidence shows that Jason didn't just fall. He was struck more than once. Evelyn froze, her breath catching in her throat. She felt as though the walls were closing in on her. She knew what the detective was getting at, and the fear she had been trying to push down surged forward with a vengeance. I didn't, Evelyn started, but the words wouldn't come. Tell me the truth, Mercer pressed. Was this really just a push? Or did something else happen after Jason hit the ground? Evelyn's head swirled with images of that morning. Jason's angry face, his threats, and the look in his eyes when he refused to leave. She had been desperate, cornered. When he had grabbed her arm, something inside her had snapped. But had she gone too far? Had she done something terrible without even realizing it? I don't know, Evelyn whispered, shaking her head. I don't remember. Mercer's eyes hardened. You do remember. You just don't want to admit it. Silence filled the room once more, the weight of Evelyn's guilt bearing down on her. She could see Jason in her mind. See the way his eyes had darkened with fury when she told him it was over, when she tried to push him away for the last time. But there was something else too. Something she hadn't wanted to remember. A vase. There had been a vase on the table, just within reach. When Jason grabbed her arm, she had picked it up. She had swung it. That's when he fell. But it hadn't stopped there. She closed her eyes, the memory too painful to face. I hit him, she finally confessed, her voice barely audible. I hit him with the vase more than once. I was so scared, I didn't know what else to do. He wouldn't let me go. Mercer's expression didn't change, but the tension in the room shifted. Evelyn had finally given her what she needed, a full confession. But there was no satisfaction in it, only a heavy sadness that filled the room like a storm cloud. Thank you for telling the truth, Mercer said, her voice softening slightly. But I need you to understand something, Evelyn. This wasn't self-defense anymore. When you kept hitting him, that's when it crossed the line. Evelyn's tears spilled over, her body shaking as the reality of what she had done set in. Jason was gone, and it was her fault. Not just an accident, not just a tragic mistake. She had killed him. The door to the interrogation room opened, and a uniformed officer stepped in. Mercer stood, nodding to her partner. You'll be taken into custody, Mrs. Carter, Mercer said quietly. We'll proceed with formal charges later today. Evelyn didn't respond. She couldn't. The weight of her confession pressed down on her like an anchor, dragging her into the depths of despair. As the officer led her out of the room, Evelyn's thoughts drifted back to her husband, Richard. She had destroyed everything. Their life, their marriage, everything. There was no coming back from this. As she walked through the hallway, she caught a glimpse of Richard through a window. He was sitting in the waiting room, his face buried in his hands. He hadn't seen her yet, but the sight of him, broken, devastated, was more than she could bear. And in that moment, Evelyn knew that the worst punishment wasn't the prison sentence she was facing. It was the knowledge that she had betrayed the people she loved most, and there was no undoing the damage.